How do you define freedom of expression?
One can define freedom of expression quite broadly. It's the ability to decide for oneself what one wants to say, what one wants to believe, and be able to communicate that with others. And I think that that's a very broad definition. I think there are lots of ways in which we see limitations on freedom of expression that sometimes might be appropriate. But at baseline, I think it's important to think about it broadly, to think about it as taking a lot of different forms, and to think about it specifically within the context of human beings' own ability to define for themselves what truth is.
Thanks. Any response to that, or any different take on that, Mr. Lukianoff?
Just slightly. I mean, people started saying freedom of expression several decades ago, in part because when people would say freedom of speech, that was mostly about actual talking and about expression of opinions. People started moving more towards the term freedom of expression because it became very clear that there's an expressive, the expressive element of like what you wear, of what you, what signs you carry, what armbands you wear, like in the Tinker v. Des Moines case. It was a way of making the point that a lot of what we think the founders would have thought of as freedom of speech is actually much more broad than that.
And I'll also just add, just to broaden this a little bit beyond the United States, that's how the international human rights regime has thought about free speech as well, that the term freedom of expression is understood within the international treaty regime, as well as wanting to be broad enough to encompass art, to encompass symbols, to encompass writings, to encompass any number of things that might be expressive that aren't specifically spoken word.
In your opening comment, you used the word limitations, and I wonder, do you feel that free speech is being restricted or limited on college campuses and academia?
I do think it's limited on college campuses and academia. I think it's inherently limited on college campuses and academia in some sense, right? In the sense that colleges are in the business of educating. And I myself, I'm in the business of educating, and part of education requires curating what students are exposed to, and trying to just design a curriculum for them to better learn to be democratic citizens, to better be able to persuade others of their ideas, right? So it's not the kind of space that I think is inherently a kind of public square, right? So administrators, faculty members make decisions about what speech to allow in a classroom, for example, and what speech not to allow. So in that sense, yes, in admissions decisions and deciding who's on the faculty and deciding what we teach, we limit speech all the time on university campuses. I think that the question, I think, gets at something deeper than that, which is, do students feel free to express themselves on campus? And I think that there is a sense in which you look at around the country and listen to what students are saying, and I think clearly students in many settings don't feel that freedom. And yep. I think that's the sort of the more interesting question is not whether freedom can ever be limited, but what are the circumstances under which it has to be fully free on campus.
Mr. Lukianoff, what's your take on that?
Well, I've been defending free speech on campus for 21 years now. And I came, from someone who specialized in First Amendment law, working at the ACLU, doing the history of freedom of speech. And already by 2001, I was surprised at how easy it was to get in trouble for what you said on a college campus. And although I've seen ups and downs throughout my career, some years better than others, I've never seen years as bad as the last two. 2020 was when we saw the greatest number of attempts to get professors fired. Threats came from both the right and the left, as they always do, but just more of them. We have a database now where we have over 530 examples of attempts to get professors fired for what they said. It used to be the case that I had never heard of a professor getting fired for what they said or taught if they were tenured. Or their research. I've seen 28 cases of that just since 2015. And 2020 was the worst year I'd seen, and that was 127 attempts. The second worst year, last year, which was 103. And that doesn't count students. Most of the cases we deal with are students. It's just oftentimes harder to find those incidents because those are very much easier to brush under the rug. So I'm very concerned about the situation on campus. There have been some bright spots. The number of speech codes have gone down after literally dozens of lawsuits against universities. But when we polled students in this past year, we polled 37,000 of them last year, and it was the case that some students felt more free to talk than others. Black students were saying that they felt the least free to be able to express their points of view, for example. But the acceptability, for example, of violence in response to a speaker you didn't like was much higher than we expected. So I've been worried throughout my career. It's kind of my job since I'm a watchdog for this stuff, but it's been a particularly bad couple of years.
You've written about trigger warnings. Can you explain what they are and sort of how they manifest themselves in academia on college campuses?
Sure. Trigger warnings are one of those topics that has such sort of, it has more like almost symbolic value than anything else, but it's become a major touchstone because people who believe in them really believe in them. So what a trigger warning is, and it originally came from a very sensible context. It was usually talking about sexual abuse or sexual assault. And it came originally, this idea started on campuses in the 90s and got to the internet, during the 2000s. And there were sites that would talk about sexual assault, for example, and they would say, trigger warning, there's going to be a graphic explanation of assault. But even by 2012, there was an idea that this was now being expected for a huge number of things. And feminists were already making fun of trigger warnings in 2012, which is why it was kind of surprising that these things became popular on campus. Now, me and my co-author Jonathan Haidt get misinterpreted on what our point is on trigger warnings all the time. And this is our argument, is that it's not that trigger warnings are silly or that people are spoiled if they request them. It's that there's no evidence that they help. There's now been something like 4 or 5 studies, and there's zero evidence that they help. That panned out. There's mainstream psychological reasons for thinking they might actually be harmful. And a couple of those studies actually show that trigger warnings can increase anxiety, but none of the studies can consider the third part of it, which is it puts professors in a difficult position to guess what they're sort of allowed to teach. So if the research came out and said these are extremely helpful for people suffering from PTSD, then you'd have to look to see how chilling it is on the class. But even the ones that were specifically about students with PTSD showed no benefit, or the opposite of benefit. It actually made people more anxious. So it's become a major symbolic issue, and these are very popular on campus, but the research contradicts it.
Professor Greene, any response on trigger warnings?
So I find myself unable to get especially worked up about trigger warnings. I get the symbolic value of talking about it. I get that it bothers a lot of people. I think if there's evidence that that's actually harmful or that it's preventing people from talking about bona fide topics, I think that's important to know. But in the grand scheme of things, I think including in the grand scheme of things around speech on campus, I think if the biggest worry we have is that people are giving warnings before they talk about sensitive topics, then I think we're not in too much trouble. But I think there's probably other issues that are more important.
Yeah, the worry is that it's causing people to avoid important topics, and this is something that Jeannie Suk-Gershon pointed out way back in 2015. She's a Harvard law professor. Is that law professors are shying away from teaching the law relating to sexual assault, for example, rape law, because it's too triggering for students, and they receive complaints. They're right around the same time. There was 7 professors signed an anonymous letter saying exactly the same thing. So it's that the downstream expectation that it's on the professor to make sure that someone isn't like triggered by what's in class is leading to self-censorship demonstrably. And when you have a situation where people are afraid to teach rape law, for example, and we covered this in great detail when I was in law school, the people who suffer the most from that are actually victims of rape. So I do think actually there are some deeper implications to why you should be concerned about trigger warnings, particularly when professors are actually saying it's encouraging them to avoid topics that students need to know about.
My own sense is that we're a good distance away from, as someone who teaches in a law school, a good distance away from people not teaching rape law or not teaching sexual assault in criminal law. It's certainly a routine part of the course, but it's totally legitimate to be worried about if that were in fact the result. And you know, if we're headed in that direction, I think that's not a great direction to head in. I'm just not sure we're there or that we're going to get there.
Professor Greene, let me start with you by asking you about, I know you've talked about, hopefully I'm not misquoting you here, something called constitutional moral hazard when it comes to campus speech. I wonder if you could explain what that concept is and maybe tell us a little bit about what, if any, role it should play in determining speech on campuses, or how it might determine a role in playing speech on campuses.
Sure, and I'll have to think back to my work and how I defined constitutional moral hazard. But the concern that I had in the article in which I use that term is that people come to believe that the fact that they have a constitutional right means that right is not harmful when exercised, or that they have some special responsibility to exercise that right? And so I worry about the language of rights and the language of freedom of speech in the context, especially in the context of a university, where I think it's quite important to be able to engage civilly with each other. So that when people start to understand their commitments and their values in terms of rights, that they kind of dig in and kind of make a point of speaking in the most outrageous or the most confrontational or the most controversial way. And I think that's really harmful. That doesn't mean people don't have a right to speak in the most outrageous or controversial way. It's to say that there's a real cost associated with tying discourse to the language of rights, which tends to be something that people feel very personally, that people feel like they need to assert, and that there is a moral value to asserting the right. And I think it's important to recognize those costs.
And Mr. Lukianoff, I would ask you, what is your take on this idea of moral hazards on campus and how we respond to them?
I think it's been an interesting sort of shift. In 1964, you had the beginning of the free speech movement on campus. By 1974, you started having the Supreme Court take this seriously in cases like Healy v. James, Papish, which was about a cartoon showing police officers raping the Statue of Liberty and the Goddess of Justice. So from very early on, this was about, you know, the right to provoke on campus, and actually being especially important to be able to provoke on campus. But by the mid 1980s, just 10 years after this became strong in the Supreme Court, you started having campuses passing speech codes. They were usually directed at people like Richard Delgado and Mary Matsuda. At my alma mater, Stanford, it was Professor Richard Gray. Justified them as ways to clamp down on sexist or racist speech. Unsurprisingly, to those of us who are First Amendment people, some of the first people who were censored under them at University of Michigan were Black students for saying things that were offensive to white students. So this all happened in the 1980s. And I think this is partially due to the fact that when you have a community that is very politically homogenous, you end up you go from thinking of freedom of speech as being good, which it was necessary. There's a reason why the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement didn't happen until the 1950s. It was because the First Amendment wasn't very strongly interpreted to about the mid 1950s. There were attempts to have all of these movements many times over in the past, but it's partially because higher education is relatively politically monolithic. It's about 95 administrators, like at Harvard, for example, 95% all left leaning. And by the way, I'm a political liberal, so I don't like this fact. And on in different departments, you're talking about 30-to-1 type ratios when it comes to the politics. What does that lead to? That leads to tribalism. It comes to not to seeing your own authority as actually, well, this isn't really power, but this is, and the thing that I find so amazing is that, for example, we have cases at Yale and Harvard all the time. These are two schools that between the two of them have $100 billion with a B dollars sitting to one side in investments. And you could be you'd be shocked to understand that they are actually not the underdog. So I've watched as people on my side of the political fence, so people on the left side of the fence who are increasingly informed by higher education, kind of pull back away from freedom of speech being very important. And that's partially because now, particularly on campus, we're extremely powerful.
So I guess I see the evolution a little bit differently than Greg here does on this. When it comes to what's sometimes referred to as the speech code movement, I do think it's important to recognize a slightly different or orthogonal aspect of the historical background, which is that colleges and universities used to be racially homogenous and were dominated by white men through the 1970s. As they began to become more diverse, that's really what led to a movement to reduce the incidence of sexual and racial harassment, which were well documented in the 1980s. Now, it's of course possible for harassment codes and for codes of civility to be misapplied. It's possible for them to go too far. It's absolutely right that the history of laws of this sort include having them being used against the populations they were intended to protect. That's absolutely right. But the motivation for them was the diversity and heterogeneity on campus, so that naturally things that may have seemed okay to say before when one is among one's own racial and sexual group were no longer okay to say. And a lot of the targets of this, some of the targets of these were, I think, targeted in ways that were misapplied, but often you're talking about drunken slurs and that sort of thing. Whatever we think of those kinds of laws, we may think they're too broad, we may think they're vague, we may think that they chill speech in various ways. If the core of them is trying to get people to recognize that drunken slurs and insulting one's roommate and that sort of thing are not okay, it does seem to me that they're motivated from a place that makes sense for a university community to be concerned about. That free speech is obviously a very important value for a university, but fostering a community of equal learning is also really valuable. And that's what they were really aimed at. And I think it's really a question of the mechanics rather than a question of whether one should have codes of civility or not.
I'm hearing both of your responses, and I get the sense that there's perhaps a tension between free speech and inclusion. And in some ways, I'm kind of shocked by that because it seems like those things should be somewhat complementary. And I completely hear what you're saying about how sometimes when these different forces are brought into contention, that they can kind of be volcanic. But let me get to solutions. How can we create a more pluralistic campus environment where we have different views and they're debated and tolerated and we can discuss each other civilly? And I will say, I've been a personal admirer of a group called Bridge USA, which really seems to be focusing a lot on civil dialogue, but would love to hear both your thoughts on that. Mr. Lukianoff, let me start with you, but I would love to hear both of you comment.
I think the first thing that has to happen is people have to look at what gets censored on campus these days, because there is a very kind of like simplistic idea that essentially like, well, you know, we have these codes and they're designed to get at bad speech and racist speech and sexist speech. So, you know, the people tend to sort of turn off there. And, you know, like this is the case from today. George Washington University started investigating a student group because they had posters that were protesting the Beijing Olympics and the treatment of the Uyghurs. This is probably the 6th case I've seen like this, where things were clearly directed at the People's Republic of China, were reinterpreted as being xenophobic, hateful to Chinese students, which was nonsense, and given the fact pattern of these cases, and used essentially as a way to chill speech. The amount of, and I do think that one of the things that's happening is that people are starting to trust experts less to a degree, and certainly trust higher education less, because it's so easy to get in trouble for what you say on so many of these campuses. They don't really trust you to have an honest dialogue in the first place. And I think that one of the things, there are many things that schools need to do to get to this place where we're having civil dialogue. But one thing that I do think that happens when your norm isn't much more sort of expansive on people get to decide among themselves themselves and their friends, how they will express themselves, is what ends up taking over. When I got to Stanford Law School, coming from a different economic background than almost anybody I went to school with, what they couldn't really see was that it was overwhelmingly upper class, usually white, relatively wealthy norms predominate, and it was amazingly sort of parochial in a lot of different ways. And I do think that when you have a community with that low low level of viewpoint diversity, it has a tendency to go that way. So I think first thing is look at what the cases actually look like. They do not look like you think they do. They are oftentimes abuses of power by the administration itself. They're on the left, they're on the right, and there's a big middle of cases where they just don't like the way the students are making the school look. So I think that's step one. Two, teach about these ideas in orientation. Explain that, the Enlightenment to a degree was a discovery that in the grand scheme of things, we don't really know all that much. And that the scientific method, all of these things are getting around the fact that left to our own devices, we tend to be pretty dunderheaded.
Well, I think it's, I think that the last suggestion of teaching tolerance of a difference of opinion is something that I certainly endorse. I do worry a bit that we don't really have a great sense of the scope of the problem, in the sense that we do have a sense of when an administrator makes a boneheaded decision, it gets attention on Twitter, it gets attention on social media, it gets a firestorm of attention. But we don't know what the denominator is, in the sense that we don't know all the cases of university civility norms being enforced in exactly the right way. From where I sit, and we all have our own subjective perspective, but from where I sit, I see universities as spaces where there's actually much more tolerance for difference of opinion and for free debate than there is in most other institutional spaces in the United States. That's a low bar, right? Because I think that there is a lot of intolerance going around. But universities, faculty members are pretty used to disagreement. We're pretty accustomed to confrontation. We're pretty accustomed to a range of opinions being voiced and being heard. And so I actually think that we can trust educators a bit more than we do to design an environment of mutual understanding, mutual respect, right? When we think about free expression, it's not just about the ability to speak, it's also about the ability to listen, and that requires some training sometimes. And that training isn't most naturally done by educators. I think one should certainly call out when they do so in a ham-handed or overly censorious way. But I just don't see this as our biggest problem.
Let me follow up here and ask a question here from the students' perspective. So I'd start with you, Professor Greene. What do you hear from students on campus, students who are in their classes, about what they think about this debate over free speech?
I honestly don't hear much from them about this, and maybe this is, maybe law students are maybe in a slightly different place and have slightly different instincts about free expression than maybe undergraduate students might. But I think I hear students being worried about their jobs, being worried about whether they'll pass their classes. The people I tend to see worried about the speech environment, at least again from where I sit, are people who are very online and get really upset about something that they hear about on a campus somewhere that isn't their own campus. That isn't I don't mean to downplay the legitimate concerns that people might have on other campuses. It's just that this hasn't been, in my experience, anywhere near the most urgent concern of students.
Mr. Lukianoff, how would you answer that question about what you might be hearing from students? Are they concerned about this debate? Are they not concerned? How does it register?
Shifting it over to, this is the biggest issue in the entire world. I do actually think it's much more important than people understand that essentially if people don't believe that their experts are able to have robust discussions, they tend to trust them less. But we see 1,500 cases a year. Most students attend about 600 colleges, so that's actually a very large number. I have seen in my career literally thousands of these cases, and we have done the largest surveys ever conducted on this, and students are saying that they are afraid of disagreeing with their teachers. They're afraid of getting in trouble for what they say. They're afraid of getting reported to the administration. 80% of them report self-censoring. Generally, students are some what 23% consider acceptable for people to use violence to stop speech. So there is actually a lot of research here. But one of the things that's so maddening about the culture war and so frustrating about it is that I hear this kind of like free speech on campus isn't really a problem, and the real problem is actually what's happening to my side. And it's amazing because yes, liberals get in trouble, conservatives get in trouble, middle of the road get in trouble, and they are telling us this. They don't look like the well-intended cases of good motives gone slightly wrong. They overall look like abuses of power or intents to impose local orthodoxy that once again looks like upper class kind of norms that don't sit very well with the rest of the country. So I do think this is an issue that it's very easy to wish away if you have an idea of, well, these are good people and they're trying to do good things. Everybody in the history of censorship always thinks they're trying to do something good, something positive. People generally don't get up in the morning and say, in the name of evil, I will continue.
So let me follow up. Professor Greene, you said a second ago, you thought that in classes today that students are debating and they're not really concerned about how those debates may go. So let me ask each of you all, should universities be putting an emphasis on teaching critical thinking skills while emphasizing how we are respecting differences of others?
I actually kind of like what Professor Greene said about teaching people to listen. One thing that I think our society is sorely lacking, and I'm ashamed to say that I've seen this in some of my friends who have the highest levels of degrees, like the PhDs, is a lack of curiosity against what other people think and why. And I think the strongest rationale for freedom of speech is the fact that it is always valuable. It's always of incredible importance to know what people really think and why, full stop. And some of the most successful programs I've seen for bridging divides, for dealing with polarization, for example, which campuses could actually be helping address, as opposed to, I believe it's actually accelerating it, is simply being willing to hear where someone's coming from, and without the idea that I'm going to immediately, I'm going to devastate this person with the next thing I say. So I do think there's lots of things campus could be doing to help get us to look at each other with scholarly eyes. Because this is the thing that I'm a first generation American, and I remember when I lived in San Francisco. Having a friend, be really proud of the fact of how much he hated Kansas, about how much he hated Middle America. This was something he would brag about. And I'm kind of like, you have to understand, my father grew up in Yugoslavia, and this sounds to me kind of like, oh, those Croatians, like they're so backwards. And it's weird that people can have that kind of sophistication on American campuses when they look at the rest of the world, but they don't seem to apply it very well inwardly.
Professor Greene, how would you answer this?
So I certainly think that teaching critical thinking skills is important. I certainly think that teaching listening skills is important. What I want to try to emphasize is that there's a couple of different ways one can. Let's assume that what we want is to teach people to think critically, to formulate opinions, to think analytically, to listen to others, to be able to persuade someone rather than just trying to own them or devastate them, as Greg says. There's a couple of different ways one can approach that, right? One can approach that by sort of maximizing the amount of speech that they're exposed to, right? There's a tradition of that's consistent with the kind of Supreme Court tradition of thinking about the marketplace of ideas, for example. This is Brandeisian and Holmesian. But one also might diagnose the problem a little bit differently, which is that the problem with today's speech ecosystem is not that there's not enough speech going around, right? People have access to speech at an unprecedented scale. It's that people don't know how to parse that speech. People don't know how to think critically about it. People don't know how to curate that speech so that they hear, so that what they are listening to is credible and is useful to them. How to teach that is difficult, but it involves doing some curation of one's own, right? Again, this is one perspective. That one of the ways in which you teach people to listen is to decide, again, as educators often do, to decide what are the different perspectives you're going to try to expose them to. Of course, when they walk out of the schoolhouse, when they walk across the street, when they go onto the University Green, they have all the access to social media, have all the access to speech that one wants them to. But the path to teaching people to be democratic citizens is not necessarily going to be a free-for-all, given that that speech today is a bit more like a fire hose than a faucet.